Welcome back, everyone, to the Wisdom of Laozi.
Great to be back.
Last time, we navigated Laozi's profound insights on favor and disgrace and explored the quiet power of valuing your true inner self.
Yeah, that was a really interesting discussion. It really set the stage, I think, for understanding how we relate to the world.
It really did. It felt like a journey into self-discovery, showing how, inner peace can often outweigh that constant need for external validation.
Indeed. And in many ways, that deep personal understanding is almost a prerequisite for what we're about to explore today. It sort of lays the foundation.
Absolutely, because today our journey takes a fascinating turn. Laozi shifts his gaze back to the Tao itself. And this is a reality so subtle, so profound, that it seems to defy all conventional perception. It's almost as if he's saying, you think you grasp reality with your senses, but what about the reality that underlies everything?
Right. It's a fundamental challenge.
It really is. As the philosopher Yu Kuyu wisely observes, great thinkers often guide us to a sense of mystery after offering clarity, and that's precisely the intriguing paradox we'll be diving into today.
It truly is a captivating challenge to our everyday thinking. Laozi's words from the D.C. Lao translation really set the stage for this deep dive into the essence of the Tao. He writes, "We look, but don't see it.
The evasive.
The evasive. We listen, but don't hear it.
The rarefied.
The rarefied. We touch, but don't grasp it the minute."
The evasive, the rarefied, the minute.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to grapple with this apparent ungraspability of the Tao.
Yeah. What does that really mean?
Exactly. We're going to unpack what these ancient descriptions truly mean, delve into the philosophical nuances of defining the indefinable, and see how this timeless wisdom can illuminate our intensely complex modern lives. We'll look at everything from how we lead organizations, in this fast-paced world, to how we cultivate our very own inner sense of purpose and find genuine contentment.
And we'll even touch upon some recent archaeological discoveries that are actually reshaping our understanding of the Tao Te Ching itself.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. It reminds us that even ancient texts, ones we thought we knew inside out, can still hold entirely new secrets and insights. So let's journey into this elusive concept, shall we?
Let's plunge in. So, to truly begin to understand the Tao, we have to return to Laozi's evocative lines from chapter 14 of the Tao Te Ching. This is the D.C. Lao translation again.
Right.
He tells us, we look but don't see it, the evasive. We listen but don't hear it, the rarefied. We touch but don't grasp it, the minute.
Powerful imagery.
It is. And then he says, these three merge into one. And he continues, painting an even more vivid picture. Its top isn't bright, its base isn't dark, unending and nameless, it returns to no-thingness.
No-thingness.
The form of the formless, the image of the imageless, this is the elusive, meet it, no head, follow it, no back.
Wow. Okay, so what's absolutely crucial here is to understand the literal meaning. When Laozi uses terms like evasive, rarefied, and minute, he's not actually describing the Tao itself as being, inherently sneaky or tiny.
Right, not like it's playing hide and seek.
Exactly. Instead, these terms illuminate our inherent inability to perceive the Tao through our conventional senses. It's a statement about the limits of human perception, not really a quality of the Tao itself.
Okay, so it's about us, not it.
Precisely. Leading scholars, in their commentaries on this very chapter, they emphasize this point. They note that precisely because it's beyond determination by sight, sound, and touch, we construe it as inseparably one.
So it's like trying to grasp air or maybe pure energy. Our senses just aren't equipped for it. These unperceivable aspects, then somehow they merge, they coalesce to form this profound one.
The one.
And this one is a reality that transcends our familiar dualities. It's beyond light and dark, beyond specific names or labels we try to put on things.
Right, it goes beyond all that.
It perpetually returns to no-thingness. It's presented as the form of the formless, the image of the imageless, utterly elusive, eternal, without beginning or end.
Yeah.
And that striking imagery of meet it, no head, follow it, no back, really drives home the point, doesn't it?
That no head, no back imagery powerfully reinforces the idea that the Tao isn't some static thing you can just encounter, define, or follow in a, straight line.
Like meeting a person or following a path.
Exactly. It's an immanent process woven into the very fabric of existence, always moving, always present. As philosophers explain, the nothingness of Tao isn't an empty void. Rather, it helps constrain our interpretation.
How so?
Well, it implies that the Tao cannot be understood as, say, a creator God with specific attributes, like the Lord on high from ancient Chinese religion. This is not some deity that stands apart from creation.
Okay, that's a key distinction right there. So it's not a first cause in the Western philosophical sense where something external sort of kicks off creation. That really challenges our typical creation
It
narratives.
absolutely does. The cosmic process in this view is rooted in itself, perpetually unfolding. It's not created or planned by some initial action or agency.
Wow.
This distinguishes it sharply from many Western cosmological theories that often posit a transcendent creator or a definite starting point in time.
Right, like the Big Bang, perhaps?
Perhaps. Instead, the Great One, which is a Taoist cosmological term for this foundational reality, it's not some transcendent ordering principle that's independent of the
It's
world.
not separate.
No. It is, as some scholars describe it, coterminous with this world, hidden within it, and circulating everywhere. This truly highlights the profoundly immanent nature of the Tao.
So it's in everything.
It is the flow, the way things are, not a being above them. The core insight here is that the Tao isn't a separate, definable object, but the dynamic principle within all things. That makes it both everywhere and nowhere, simultaneously present and, well, ungraspable.
Okay, that clarifies it. So if it's so fundamentally ungraspable and it defies conventional perception, how do you even begin to talk about it?
Yeah, that's the challenge Laozi faced.
He employs what scholars call a negative method, defining the Tao by stating what it is not.
Exactly. Apophatic, almost.
One early commentator explains that these qualities, the evasive, rarefied, minute, they just reflect our human sensory limitations. We simply can't grasp it with our five senses.
And this approach isn't unique to Laozi or ancient China. We see fascinating parallels in Western mystical theology.
Oh, really?
Yeah, where ultimate truth is also often defined through negation, a practice sometimes called apophatic theology. It's a way of saying, it's not this, it's not that, in an attempt to point towards something that inherently transcends all our usual categories or descriptions.
Trying to fence it in by saying what's outside the fence?
Sort of. It's about stripping away what it isn't to get closer to what it is, without ever fully capturing it in words.
So it's like trying to describe silence by saying what it isn't. Not loud, not noisy, not talkative. But that doesn't tell you what silence actually is, only what it lacks, or maybe what it allows.
Precisely. And if you try to intellectualize it too much, you're just creating more words, more concepts, more traps, in a way.
Right. Yet this very concept of the ungraspable wasn't without its critics, even back in ancient China. Thinkers like Wang Fuzi famously challenged this. He asked, if the Tao is truly one, how can we possibly grasp it?
That's a great point.
It sounds like a fundamental contradiction, doesn't it? To grasp the ungraspable one. This highlights the immense challenge Laozi faced in articulating something unnameable. And it really forces us to reconsider the very nature of language itself.
It absolutely does. Wang Fuzi's criticism is incredibly insightful because it points to a core tension that Laozi navigated. He was attempting to use language, our limited tool, to communicate a reality that inherently resists linguistic capture.
The tool isn't fit for the job, in a sense.
In a way, yes. The very act of naming or describing from this perspective creates distinctions that move us further away from the undifferentiated one. Other ancient Chinese thinkers, like Zhuangzi and later Zen masters, echoed the sentiment. They often suggested that words are merely traps for truth.
Traps for truth. I like that.
Yeah. To cling too tightly to verbal descriptions is to miss the Tao entirely. One famous Zen master advises that the Tao must be grasped through stillness, not through intellectual effort or categorization.
Wow, so it's experiential.
It's about direct, unmediated experience, maybe a flash of insight, rather than logical deduction.
That makes a lot of sense. And this brings us to a really interesting point about language itself. Scholars argue that our modern Western linguistic theories often assume there's a meaning hovering around our use of language, almost like a private mental picture dictionary that links words directly to objects.
Right, a one-to-one mapping.
But classical Chinese philosophers, it suggested, often viewed language quite differently. They focused more on language and its relation to language users within a social context,
How people use it.
rather than its direct one-to-one relation to the world, what we call semantics.
And what's truly fascinating here is how this reorients our entire understanding of the Tao. If we read Taoists through a purely Western or even a Buddhist lens, assuming Tao is a metaphysical object or maybe an unchanging abstract one behind the many,
Which is a common assumption.
it is. But we risk misinterpreting it. This would mistakenly align Taoism with philosophies that characterize ultimate reality as, say, a monistic, unchanging, pure being, or maybe paradoxically, pure non-being. It forces it into categories it doesn't necessarily fit.
So if it's not a metaphysical object, not a static entity, and not a first cause, then what is the Tao in this context? How should we understand it?
It's perhaps best understood as a guiding way, a prescriptive discourse, a how-to for navigating reality, maybe.
A guiding way.
Okay. From this perspective, Taoist skepticism isn't really about language's inability to metaphysically capture the Tao, but rather about the fluidity of convention within language itself.
Meaning language changes, its meaning shift.
Exactly. And because of that, any prescriptive discourse, any Tao that language can express, cannot be a constantly reliable guide to behavior in a world that is inherently dynamic and changing.
That's a truly provocative idea. It suggests that rigidity in language, or even in our thinking, is precisely what pulls us away from the Tao. So by trying to be too precise, too fixed, we miss the point entirely.
Exactly. This leads to the rather counterintuitive idea that sometimes to misuse the distinctions could frequently be a superior strategy.
Misused distinctions, how so?
It hints at the benefits of forgetting distinctions or playing with them, rather than just baldly advocating an opposite discourse. It's not about finding the right definition, but about recognizing the limitations of all definitions.
Okay.
One scholar characterizes the Laozi as a masterpiece of a kind of intelligence at the opposite pole from the logical.
Interesting. Not illogical, but non-logical.
Precisely. It concentrates instead of explicating, starkly juxtaposes instead of filling in gaps. It's less about precise logical arguments and more about evocative paradoxical insights that challenge us to think differently.
It makes you work for the meaning.
It does. The core insight here might be that our very language can trap us. When we label a challenge as a problem, it often feels fixed and immovable. But maybe by seeing it as a process or a dynamic situation, we immediately open ourselves to fluidity and novel solutions.
I can certainly see how that would be a very different way of thinking about language and reality, and this is beautifully illustrated by what are called the Wu forms in the Dao Ding.
Ah, yes, the Wu forms, very important.
These Wu forms, like Wu Wei for non-action, Wu Jing for non-contention, Wu Ming for namelessness, and Wu Yu for objectless desires, they're designed, scholars say, to dissolve philosophical concepts and theories.
Break them down.
Exactly, helping us return constrained energies to concrete feelings and the immediate experience they animate, getting back to the lived reality.
This is a crucial point. For instance, whimming, often translated as the nameless, doesn't necessarily mean the Tao has no name in a void.
Okay.
It actually suggests a kind of naming that doesn't assign fixed, rigid reference to things. It allows for fluidity and avoids what one philosopher called misplaced concreteness.
Misplaced concreteness. That's a great term. So language, while incredibly powerful for enabling distinctions and categorizing our world,
Which it is, undeniably.
can also distort the way in which we understand our world.
Wow.
We often reify abstract concepts, meaning we treat them as if they're concrete things, more real and static than the dynamic, changing events of our actual experience.
We freeze them.
Yes. This linguistic habit can institutionalize and enforce an overly static vision of the world, which, ironically, stifles creativity and our ability to adapt. The key insight here seems to be that our language can inadvertently create rigid mental constructs. When we label a concept, we risk freezing it in time instead of appreciating its dynamic nature. By understanding this, we can actively seek more fluid ways to describe reality, fostering innovation and adaptability.
Yes, exactly. This concept is further reinforced by the observation that the vocabulary of the Tao Te Ching is fundamentally Zhuandive.
Zhuandive, like verb forms ending in
Precisely. Now, Zhuandive simply means that instead of seeing things as fixed nouns like the Tao as an object, they're understood as active processes like verbs. Think of it less as the Tao and more like Taoing.
Taoing. I like that.
An ongoing state of becoming, always in motion. Things are understood as active processes and ongoing events, with nouns deriving from and reverting to a verbal sensibility. Our English language, with its heavy emphasis on substance and essence, sometimes struggles to fully express this dynamic worldview. We tend to fall back on static nouns.
So when we say the Tao, our English-speaking minds immediately think of a thing or an object, but it's really more like Taoing, an ongoing process, a verb rather than a noun. It's the flow itself.
Precisely. This also relates to distinguishing between a style name, Z, which might illuminate the character or disposition of something in a fluid way, and a proper name, Ming, which often attempts to assign a fixed, exhaustive identity.
Like a label versus a description.
Kind of. Dowings can be evoked as a style name, indicating its unbounded and ever-novel nature, but not a proper name, because no single definition can ever contain its inexhaustible possibilities. It's an unfolding, not a static entity that can be fully captured and contained.
This sounds very different from how some Western religions might describe a divine entity or a creator god with defined attributes. It's not an external, static power.
It is indeed fundamentally different. The nothingness of Tao, as we mentioned, helps impose constraints on interpretation. It implies that it cannot be understood as a creator god with attributes, like the Lord on High of ancient Chinese religion.
That's a vital distinction.
It is, and often missed when trying to interpret Taoism through a Western theological lens, which might instinctively look for a supreme being with agency and intent. Furthermore, as some scholars clarify, the Tao in the Laozi is not an origin, principle, or ultimate beginning that precedes time or the cosmos.
So, not before time started.
No. Instead, the cosmic process is rooted in itself, not created or planned by an initial action or agency. This distinguishes it sharply from many Western cosmological theories that look for a linear cause and effect from a distinct starting point.
And this great one, a Taoist cosmological term. It's not a transcendent ordering principle independent of the world, but as philosophers describe, it is coterminous with this world, hitting within it and circulating everywhere.
Exactly. It highlights the profoundly immanent nature of the Tao. It is the flow, the way things are, not a being above or separate from them. It is the very essence of the unfolding universe.
Okay.
So to sum up this first part, the Tao is ungraspable, not because it's hiding or because it's beyond existence, but because our conventional senses and language are simply inadequate to perceive and describe its dynamic, formless, and immanent nature. It's a guiding way, rather than a fixed object. The core insight here might be that true understanding often comes not from finding the perfect definition, but from recognizing the limitations of definition itself. When you encounter something truly profound, perhaps the best way to grasp it is to let go of the need to grasp.
Okay, so if the Tao is this elusive, ungraspable, formless guiding way, more like Taoing, how on earth does Laozi then offer this profound directive for practical living and governance? He says, hold fast to the way of antiquity to manage today, knowing the origin is the thread of the way.
Right. It seems like a contradiction.
It does. This raises a central philosophical challenge. How can the formless, the ungraspable Tao, possibly guide the formed concrete realities of everyday life and governance? It seems like a massive leap.
It's an excellent question, and it's precisely where we see a stark contrast in interpretation, even within ancient China itself. Consider the legalist philosopher Han Feizi, for instance.
Yeah, the legalists. Very different school of thought.
Very different. He interpreted Laozi's directive politically, suggesting that the ruler defines the Tao to control others. For legalists, Fa or standards were objective, universal, impartial rules primarily directed at controlling the ministers and ensuring their performance. Their emphasis was on strong, centralized, top-down control.
So it was about creating a system where the ruler was the absolute authority and the laws themselves, rather than the ruler's personal morality, ensured order. A very structured approach.
Precisely. This approach believed that by setting up proper institutional structures, the moral character of the ruler became largely irrelevant. People would naturally hold authority in awe. Han Feizi's theory explicitly aimed to maintain an aura of mystery and distance between the ruler and ministers.
Keep them guessing.
Yeah. From his legalist perspective, the ruler's wu-wei, or non-action, meant not intervening personally in day-to-day affairs, but letting the institutional framework do the work. He saw Confucian ideals of moral persuasion as naive and ineffective. It was a very pragmatic, power-focused interpretation, completely focused on state control.
Fascinating, but that sounds completely at odds with what we might intuitively think of as a Taoist approach to governance, which often brings to mind ideas of natural flow and minimal interference.
You're absolutely right. There's a fundamental philosophical chasm here. In contrast, Taoist scholars argue that Laozi's teaching is not about mastering the Tao to control, but about aligning with the Tao's flow.
Alignment versus control.
Exactly. It's about discerning the natural course of things rather than imposing one's will. The fundamental difference in philosophy. The core insight here might be that true influence isn't about exerting force, but about understanding and aligning with the underlying patterns of things. This means less effortful pushing and more effortless flow.
I'm trying to picture this. To make this alignment tangible, maybe think of a master sailor.
Good analogy.
They don't fight against the waves during a storm. Instead, they use timeless knowledge of the ocean's currents, wind patterns, the vessel's design.
Working with the elements.
Exactly, to move through them effortlessly, sometimes even seeming to glide.
This leads us directly to the principle of non-action, or wu wei, in governance. The Dao Jing advocates a distinct form of governance characterized by wu wei, which, importantly, is not inaction or apathy.
Right, not just doing nothing.
No, but rather non-coercion or non-interfering action. The ideal is that when rulers practice this, the common people are free to develop along their own lines, order themselves, and prosper themselves, becoming of themselves like unworked wood, natural, spontaneous. That's from chapter 57.
So it's an ideal where social order emerges spontaneously from the bottom up. Leadership is so subtle that people might not even realize it's there. A hidden hand, not a heavy fist. A leadership style that trusts in the inherent order of things.
It is indeed. Chapter 29 of the Dao Jing delivers a powerful warning against forceful intervention. It states unequivocally, if someone wants to rule the world and goes about trying to do so, I foresee that they simply will not succeed.
Strong words.
The world is a sacred vessel and is not something that can be ruled. Those who would rule it, ruin it. Those who would control it, lose it.
Wow. The world is a sacred vessel.
It emphasizes a deep respect for the intrinsic nature of things, discouraging any form of aggressive or domineering intervention. It's really a call for humility in leadership.
That's a profound statement. It really speaks to the idea that some things just aren't meant to be tampered with or controlled. It reminds me of modern ideas about complex adaptive systems where top-down control often just breaks things rather than building them.
Exactly. And to elaborate on the sage ruler's approach, scholars highlight that in the Laozi, the ideal sage ruler has no political desires whatsoever.
No desires. How does that work?
Well, the hope is that this will prevent such desires from arising in the state more broadly. This ruler actively avoids having a personal agenda or an overarching ideology, because such personal aims would likely cause others to have different agendas or ideologies, inevitably leading to political competition and strife.
So the ruler's job is almost to be empty.
In the sense, their main duty is to ensure order emerges from nowhere by actively preventing personal interests from dominating the center of power. It's an absence of personal will at the top that paradoxically allows for natural order and collective well-being to emerge from below.
So it's not just about what the ruler does, but what they don't do, and even what they don't desire. That's incredibly counterintuitive for many modern leaders who often feel they must have a strong vision and push an agenda. How does a leader who desires nothing actually achieve anything?
It's a brilliant paradox. The nothing they desire isn't apathy, but a lack of personal, self-serving desires. That allows them to truly align with the Tao.
Okay, that makes more sense.
This brings us to another pervasive Wu form. Wu Jing, striving without contentiousness.
Driving without fighting about it.
Essentially, yes. Chapter 66 of the Dao Jing concludes with the sage's conduct, observing, is it not because they strive without contentiousness that no one in the world is able to contend with them? This is not passive inaction, but an active, profoundly effective way of working with the flow of things, leading to effortless superiority because you're not creating resistance.
It sounds almost like water flowing around a stone. It gets where it's going without a fight.
Precisely.
And speaking of confrontation, I'm struck by the Dao Jing's remarkably uncompromising view of warfare. It's not just a strategy, but a deep philosophical stance, isn't it?
It is, profoundly so. The Laozi expresses deep disdain for war, viewing it primarily as a social disaster and a continuation of failed politics.
Failed politics, ouch.
It finds nothing attractive in war and weapons, asserting that to have a liking for weapons means to have a liking for killing men, a liking for slaughter.
Yeah.
It doesn't romanticize conflict in any way.
That's a very blunt and uncompromising view, especially for a text that has influenced military strategists over the centuries. It's almost a moral condemnation, but framed in very practical terms.
Exactly. While warfare is considered deplorable and perhaps on occasion unavoidable,
A last resort.
the Dad Fing advises fighting coolly and without enthusiasm. That's from chapter 31. Able commanders get these results and accommodate them only as a last resort. Chapter 30. This is far from glorifying battle. The strategic advice for commanders is to be detached, almost mournful, about the necessity of conflict.
And the martial arts of the Laozi are described as being founded on passivity and defense.
Right.
The Taoist commander wins by mastering the efficacy of not fighting. Jing, chapter
Right.
68 again. This involves practicing utmost restraint and avoiding emotional involvement or any display that could lead to vulnerability.
Letting the opponent defeat themselves.
Exactly. Allowing the enemy to defeat itself through overexpenditure of energy. It's a strategy of strategic retreat and subtle influence rather than direct confrontation.
It is. Think of a martial artist who uses their opponent's own momentum against them, rather than meeting force head-on with force. That's the essence.
Makes sense.
And significantly, the Laozi does not engage in moral justifications for war. It doesn't divide the world into good guys and bad guys, nor does it speak of just cause or liberating efforts.
That's striking. No just war theory here.
Not really.
Yeah.
From the perspective of the Laozi, talk of a just, a necessary, or a liberating war can, like heroism, appear as the somewhat presumptuous and pompous self-aggrandizement of a social loser.
Wow. Social loser. That's harsh.
It is. The two practical attitudes are simple. Avoid it, or, if unavoidable, win it with the least possible damage to yourself. This is a profoundly different ethical framework than many Western traditions, which also ground morality in rational free agency and backward-looking theories of desert or justice.
So it really emphasizes pragmatism and self-preservation over moral crusades. That's a stark contrast to much of the rhetoric we hear around conflict today, which often centers on who is right or justified. It's a remarkably detached, almost clinical view of conflict. The core insight here might be that true strength in conflict isn't about moral superiority or brute force, but about a detached wisdom that knows when not to contend, allowing situations to resolve themselves or opponents to overextend. We've talked a lot about the philosophical underpinnings of the Tao, its elusive nature, and its implications for governance. But how has this understanding evolved over time? Because let's be honest, when most people hear Taoism today, they might think of temples, rituals, practices aimed at longevity, maybe even martial arts.
Right, a whole religious dimension.
That seems a long way from the abstract no-thingness we've been discussing.
You're touching on a crucial point. The shifting, often multifaceted nature of Taoism itself throughout history. Over centuries, what began as philosophical Taoism, known as Daojia, primarily associated with foundational texts like the Laozi and Zhuangzi, gradually evolved into a distinct religious tradition, Daojia.
And Daojia. Okay.
This transformation meant a significant shift from abstract philosophical concepts and political theory to more concrete practices, communal rituals, and specific beliefs aimed at personal and collective well-being in a more, let's say, spiritual sense.
So the very nature of the Tao itself changed in popular understanding, from an impersonal cosmic principle to something that could be accessed for tangible personal benefits, like health or long life.
Precisely. We see this vividly in texts like the Jing commentary, which reflects this profound shift by claiming that ancient immortals actually proved the Tao's power.
Ah, the immortals.
Yes. This led to holding the way, being interpreted not just as aligning with a cosmic flow, but as a literal path to achieving eternal life or supernatural abilities. Consequently, Laozi himself, the perceived author of the Tao Te Ching, became a deified figure.
Laozi became a god.
He became revered as a divine manifestation of the Tao, as scholars explain. The focus moved from a philosophical alignment with the natural flow of the universe to a quest for immortality and supernatural powers, with Laozi transforming into a divine guide, a celestial patriarch.
So the original intent of the text, as we discussed earlier, was not religious in this sense. It wasn't about deification or the search for immortality.
Historically, scholars point out that the Laozi text was, initially, a guide on what may be called political philosophy, or more specifically, a treatise on how to preserve or constitute order in society and, by extension, in the cosmos.
Statecraft and harmony.
Right. It wasn't until the Han Dynasty, roughly from 206 BCE to 220 CE, that it truly became a cornerstone of religious activities, and that religious Taoism, Daojiao, really took off as a significant social phenomenon, attracting popular devotion and forming organized communities. So the book was originally about statecraft and cosmic order, offering principles for a harmonious society, not about deification or personal immortality per se.
That's a pretty significant shift in application and interpretation over time. And speaking of the text itself, there's also the ongoing question of the original Tao Te Ching. Some scholars express skepticism about whether there ever was a single, definitive, original version.
Yeah, the idea of a single author is debated.
But then we have these incredible archaeological discoveries, like the Moang Dui manuscripts unearthed in 1973 and the Gaudian text discovered in 1993. These finds are physically over a millennium older than previously available versions. The core insight here seems to be that while Taoism evolved into a religion, its philosophical roots offer a powerful personal cultivation practice. We can internalize these forces of softness and stillness to tap into an inherent, non-aggressive potency. We've explored the subtle, ungraspable nature of the Tao, its historical interpretations, and how it shifted from philosophy to religion. But now for the ultimate question. How does this ancient, formless wisdom translate to our intensely complex modern lives? Can the ungraspable Tao truly offer practical, actionable guidance in a world that often demands concrete, measurable solutions where everything seems visible and quantifiable?
It absolutely can, and I'd argue its relevance is perhaps more critical now than ever before. Let's start with leadership, a topic where the principles of the Tao offer a striking contrast to conventional approaches.
Okay, leadership. How does it apply?
In modern leadership, we could observe a clear distinction. Reactive leaders often chase every trend, constantly adapting to surface-level changes, to the latest market demand or the newest technological shift. They're responding to the immediate, the tangible, the loudest voices.
And often they just end up chasing their own tail, constantly shifting focus, burning out their teams, and experiencing decision fatigue. It's leadership by reactivity, always putting out fires.
Exactly. They get caught in the superficial currents. In contrast, visionary leaders, the ones who truly make a lasting impact, act from a place of deep values, what Laozi might call the way of antiquity.
Their core principles.
Yes. This allows them to stay steady amid chaos, much like the formless Tao guides the formed world. They aren't swayed by every fleeting trend because they are rooted in something more fundamental, something ungraspable yet profoundly stable. They grasp the underlying currents rather than fighting every wave.
Can you give an example?
Think of a CEO who refuses to compromise on ethical manufacturing even when it impacts short-term profits, because integrity is their ancient way. That's a Taoist leader in action. The core insight for leaders is, don't chase every trend. Find your unchanging ancient way, your deepest values, and let them be your anchor in chaos. This allows for adaptability that isn't reactive, but deeply informed.
So their leadership isn't about imposing a rigid structure from the outside, but about discerning the natural flow of their organization or market and aligning with that. That sounds very much like the Wu Wei principle we discussed earlier applied to the boardroom.
It is very similar, yes.
And this principle extends powerfully to our personal lives, especially in an age where we are perpetually overwhelmed with stimuli. From endless notifications pinging on our devices to a constant stream of news, social media, information overload, it's easy to feel lost at sea.
Totally drift.
In this environment, holding fast to your core values becomes a crucial inner compass.
It's precisely that. Imagine trying to navigate a dense fog without a compass, just reacting to every sound and faint light. It would be disorienting and exhausting.
You'd go in circles.
But with an inner compass, a stable reference point, you can move forward with confidence even when the external world is opaque. This practice aligns perfectly with Laozi's instruction that knowing the origin is the thread of the way. It offers clarity and purpose amidst confusion. It's about finding that deep stillness within, from which true insight and direction can emerge, even when the world is screaming for your attention. For your personal life, the takeaway is clear. In a world of infinite distractions, your core values are not just ideals, they are your most reliable navigation system. Cultivate them as your inner compass to find clarity amidst noise.
So rather than getting swept away by the current of endless demands, you have an internal anchor, a subtle thread that guides you through the labyrinth of modern life. And this profound wisdom also deeply informs the Taoist attitude toward desire and contentment.
Yes, desire is a big one in the Laozi.
The Taoist attitude toward desire, as found in the Laozi, is distinctly not ascetic. It does not advocate for a forced denial of pleasures or purging oneself of sinfulness, which is a common misconception about many Eastern philosophies.
Indeed, it's a critical nuance often missed. Instead, desires are not seen as inherently evil, but rather medically rejected as symptoms of discontent, as one scholar puts it.
Symptoms, like a fever, indicates illness.
Exactly. They are diagnostic, pointing to an underlying unease or lack of alignment. He introduces the fascinating concept of a paradoxical hedonism in the Laozi.
Paradoxical hedonism, what does that mean?
This approach aims at achieving perfect contentment in one's present situation by preventing the emergence of ultimately insatiable cravings.
Preventing cravings. Okay, that's the paradoxical part. It challenges our common understanding of happiness and pleasure, which often involves fulfilling desires. But isn't there a risk here of becoming too content, of losing the drive for improvement or innovation if all cravings are simply prevented? How does this differ from simple complacency?
That's an excellent question, and it's where the paradoxical part truly comes into play. It's not about becoming complacent or losing motivation. Instead, it's a philosophy that actively works to prevent addiction. Understood here not just in the modern sense of substance abuse, but more broadly as a state of compulsory consumption that never leads to actual fulfillment.
Always needing the next hit, the next purchase, the next achievement.
Right, perpetually projecting satisfaction into the future. The Taoist ideal is immediate and present satisfaction, which is only possible when desires do not violate a perfect contentment with the present moment. If your desires constantly point to a future satisfaction, you are perpetually discontent in the present, always chasing, never arriving. It's about finding fulfillment in the now, not endlessly deferring it. The profound shift here is to redefine happiness not as the attainment of more, but as the active prevention of insatiable craving. Real joy is found in the present moment, not projected into an endless future of wanting.
That really reframes the whole idea of desire, not as a moral failing or a sign of weakness, but as a practical obstacle to contentment, a kind of internal bug that prevents us from experiencing true satisfaction. And this ties seamlessly into the idea of emotional impartiality or indifference and a broader perspective, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The Taoist sage, according to scholars, is free from human vanity, free from the impulse to determine what is right and what is wrong. This applies across various domains, aesthetically, morally, emotionally, and even scientifically, meaning they avoid rigid, prejudiced judgments about the nature of things.
So, no strong opinions.
Not in the sense of rigid preferences. Unlike others who might strongly prefer the beautiful over the ugly or good over evil, the sage does not know that one of the segments is better or more valid than the other. They transcend these binary judgments.
So they don't get caught up in rigid judgments or preferences, which often fuel our emotional roller coaster. It's about a detached, non-judgmental observation.
They're able to equally appreciate the two moments as equally constitutive of reality or of the movement of the Tao, without prejudice, understanding them as mutually dependent elements of change.
Like yin and yang.
Exactly. This is beautifully exemplified by the ancient Chinese story of the old man at the fort, who maintains emotional impartiality despite changing fortunes.
Ah, the farmer whose horse runs away.
That's the one. He sees the good in the bad and the bad in the good as part of an unending flow, never labeling an event as definitively good or bad. A lost horse might lead to a new horse, which might lead to a broken leg, which might save you from war. Every event contains its opposite. The practical wisdom here is profound. Cultivate emotional impartiality. Instead of rigidly judging events as good or bad, see them as interconnected parts of a larger, ever-changing flow. This perspective liberates you from the emotional highs and lows, granting inner stability.
That story is a classic, reminding us that what seems like misfortune can turn into a blessing, and vice versa. It's about maintaining perspective through the constant flux, acknowledging the inherent uncertainty of life.
This profound perspective links directly back to Chapter 40 of the Tao Te Ching, which observes that returning is how way-making moves, and weakening is how it functions.
Returning and weakening.
As some scholars note, cosmology in this context is not a linear progression, but an endless alternation between rising and falling, emerging and collapsing, a continuing spiral that is always coming back upon itself and yet is ever new.
So change isn't just a disruption, it's the fundamental nature of reality, and within that, there's a constant return to the origin, which then allows for novelty. It's like a cosmic breath inhaling, exhaling, and with each breath, something new emerges, but always from the same underlying source.
Precisely. Other scholars expand on this, explaining the human experience is most replete and rich when we entertain both its determinate and indeterminate aspects, appreciating both the contingent boundaries that give meaning and the spontaneous emergence of novelty that can only be immediately felt.
Embracing structure and surprise.
Yes. It's about embracing both the structure and the surprise of existence, the known and the ungraspable. The key here is to embrace life's inherent flux. Don't resist change. Recognize that returning to core principles is what enables constant novelty. This allows you to find stability within the spiral of life, not by escaping it.
What stands out to me is how often we, in our modern world, try to impose our will, to define and control everything, when the Tao suggests a more fluid, adaptive, and ultimately more effective approach. It's a radical shift in perspective, to say the least, to trust in the ungraspable.
It truly is a lifelong practice, perhaps.
This deep dive into grasping the ungraspable truly reminds us of a powerful, enduring truth. To genuinely manage the present, we must connect with the timeless, subtle essence of the Tao. It's not about forcing an outcome, but about aligning with the flow.
Laozi's words resonate deeply here, a profound whisper across millennia. Hold fast to the way of antiquity to manage the things of today, knowing the origin is the thread of the way. That thread isn't a rigid chain of rules, but a subtle guide, a profound inner compass that allows us to navigate complexities with grace and effectiveness.
So as you go about your week, maybe consider this provocative thought. Think about just one area in your life that feels chaotic or overwhelming right now.
Could be work, relationships, anything.
Instead of immediately trying to impose a rigid solution or control every variable, just step back for a moment. Ask yourself, what timeless core principle, what ancient way should genuinely guide me here?
It might be something simple, like act with kindness, or focus on the essential, or maybe cultivate patience. Once you identify that principle, that thread of the way, try to return to your task, your challenge, or your relationship, using that principle as your quiet, ungraspable guide.
Can you cultivate the efficacy of not contending in that specific area? Not just in external conflicts, but maybe in the internal struggle with constant information and demands for fixed definitions.
Can you let go a little?
Can you embrace the no-thingness of these core principles, allowing for true novelty and spontaneous wisdom to emerge in a world that so desperately craves concrete answers, rather than imposing your will or fighting against the natural flow?
It's a challenge,
Yeah.
definitely. To let go of the need for definitive answers and instead find peace and effectiveness in the process itself, trusting the subtle underlying way. Next time, our deep dive will continue as we shift our focus from the abstract principles to the concrete examples. We'll meet those who are said to have truly grasped the Tao ancient masters.
What were they really like, beyond the legends? Exactly. What can we learn from their lives and experiences, not just their words?
It promises to be another enlightening journey into the heart of timeless wisdom. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. Thanks for listening. Until next time.